In early 1944, the hill country between Burma and northeast India formed a junction of several wars at once: the wider Pacific conflict, the struggle for control of Burma, and the future of British rule in the subcontinent. The towns of Imphal and Kohima lay on a single mountain road linking the large Allied base at Dimapur in the Brahmaputra Valley with the forward logistics hub on the Manipur Plain. By then, Imphal had been developed into a major depot and airfield complex, while Dimapur stored the fuel, ammunition, and food for an eventual advance back into Burma. This situation had been created by the rapid Japanese conquest of Burma in 1942. Japanese forces advancing from Thailand captured Rangoon in March 1942, cutting the Burma Road to China and forcing British, Indian, and Chinese troops into a long retreat northwards and then west across the Chindwin River into India. Allied authority in much of Burma collapsed. Burmese nationalist groups sought advantage in the power vacuum, and hundreds of thousands of civilians moved along the same routes as the retreating soldiers, often without organized transport or supplies. For Tokyo, control of Burma created a shield for the resource areas of Southeast Asia and pushed the front line to the Indian frontier. For London and New Delhi, the loss of Burma raised direct questions about the security of India. At the same time, Indian politics were in flux. The Quit India movement, launched in August 1942, led to mass arrests of the Congress leadership, while the colonial government relied on loyalist parties, the administrative service, and the armed forces to maintain control. Yet recruitment into the British Indian Army expanded sharply, from about 200,000 men in 1939 to more than 1.5 million by the end of 1942, and eventually over 2.5 million by August 1945, almost all volunteers. A significant share of these troops were earmarked for service in the Burma theater and for defense of the long northeastern frontier. In 1943, the Allies reorganized their command structure. Southeast Asia Command, under Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, took responsibility for operations in Burma and neighboring regions, while General William Slim's 14th Army became the main land force in the theater. Over roughly 18 months, 14th Army developed road, rail, and air links to bases at Dimapur and Imphal, stockpiling fuel, rations, and ammunition for an offensive back across the Chindwin. Air transport over the hump to China and construction of the Ledo Road turned northeast India into a logistics corridor for both the Burma front and Chinese forces. The Japanese command reached a different set of conclusions from the same geography. In mid-1943, Burma Area Army was formed under Lieutenant General Masakazu Kawabe, with 15th Army under Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi responsible for central Burma and the approaches to Imphal and Assam. Japanese staff saw Allied buildup at Imphal and Dimapur as preparation for a large offensive that might push them out of Burma and expose Thailand and Malaya. Mutaguchi argued instead for a preemptive move into India, defeat the British and Indian Fourth Corps around Imphal, capture Kohima to cut the Dimapur-Imphal road, and, if possible, advance into the Brahmaputra Valley to disrupt the rail and air routes supplying both Burma and China. By early 1944, the opposing forces in this sector were substantial. Around Imphal and Kohima, the Allies could draw on Fourth Corps and other formations, with about 120,000 British, Indian, and Gurkha troops and 66 tanks on the Imphal front alone. Mutaguchi's plan, Operation U-Go, envisaged committing three main infantry divisions, the 15th, 31st, and 33rd, plus supporting troops, amounting to roughly 85,000 men in the forward echelons of 15th Army, with limited armor and artillery. Both sides expected the terrain and climate to shape operations. Steep jungle-covered ridges, narrow roads, and heavy monsoon rain placed a premium on pack transport, air supply, and disciplined infantry. The campaign also involved two contrasting Indian armed formations. The British Indian Army, under 14th Army and Eastern Command, recruited across many regions and communities of the subcontinent and fought to defend what was still officially British India. The Indian National Army, originally formed from prisoners of war captured in Malaya and Singapore in 1942, and later reorganized under Subhas Chandra Bose, sought to enter India alongside Japanese units as an army of liberation. By the time of the Imphal offensive, 2 INA brigades were allocated to support Japanese attacks from the south and east, with their own political objectives and propaganda. Local civilian populations formed another layer of this prelude. In the Naga Hills, Manipur, and adjoining areas, Naga, Manipuri, and other communities lived in villages close to the projected battlefields. Some had recent experience of Allied retreat and Japanese occupation in Burma. Others had long-standing links to the colonial administration through labor recruitment, missionary schools, or small trade networks. As both armies surveyed routes and stockpiled supplies before 1944, these communities were drawn into intelligence gathering, porterage, and sometimes forced labor, while also trying to maintain agriculture and local authority structures. The memory of the 1942 retreat shaped expectations on both sides. Japanese planners believed that British and Indian troops, who had withdrawn in disorder from Burma, would not withstand a determined offensive if supply lines were cut and monsoon conditions exploited. Allied commanders, recalling shortages of transport, air cover, and medical support during that retreat, emphasized training in jungle warfare, malaria control, and above all the use of air supply to avoid abandonment of encircled units. By the beginning of March 1944, this combination of strategic calculation, political tension, and local vulnerability set the stage for the opening movements toward Imphal and Kohima. In February 1944, the decision taken in Japanese headquarters began to turn into concrete movement on the ground. At Burma Area Army level in Rangoon, staff translated the approved concept for Operation U-Go into detailed marching tables and supply allocations for 15th Army. Under Mutaguchi, 3 infantry divisions received their axes of advance. 33rd Division from the south, along the Tiddim Road toward Imphal, 15th Division across the Chindwin near Tamu against the eastern approaches, and 31st Division through the hill country toward Kohima and the Dimapur railhead. In total, roughly 85,000 Japanese troops in these divisions and attached formations, plus several thousand men of the Indian National Army, were earmarked for the march toward the Indian frontier, supported by limited artillery and engineer units. The concentration of these forces in central Burma took place under strict radio discipline. Units moved from lower Burma by rail where track existed, then continued on foot along forest tracks and cart roads to staging areas on the east bank of the Chindwin River. Most transport consisted of pack animals and coolie columns. Motor vehicles were few and had to halt far behind the forward elements once metalled roads ended. Each division received a scale of rations and ammunition intended to last for a defined number of days after crossing the frontier, on the assumption that further supplies would be captured from Allied dumps in the Imphal Basin and along the road to Kohima. On the Allied side, the opening weeks of 1944 were still shaped by plans for their own advance back into Burma. 14th Army anticipated a step-by-step move across the Chindwin when road construction and stockpiling were sufficient. At Imphal, 4th Corps under Lieutenant General Geoffrey Scoons held responsibility for the immediate frontier sector. Its 17th Indian Light Division guarded the Tiddim Road to the south. 20th Indian Division covered the Tamu and Kabul Valley approaches in the east. 23rd Indian Division and other forces formed a reserve in and around the Imphal Plain. Further north, in the Naga Hills and around Kohima, other formations under Eastern Army and, later, 63rd Corps guarded the Dimapur-Imphal Road and the railhead in the Brahmaputra Valley. Intelligence assessments in Allied headquarters produced mixed signals. Air reconnaissance and intercepted traffic during late 1943 and early 1944 indicated increased Japanese activity west of the Irrawaddy and along the Chindwin. However, many staff officers believed that Japanese logistics would limit them to local offensives inside Burma, perhaps aimed at disrupting Allied preparations, but not at a large-scale invasion of India. The memory of previous Japanese advances encouraged caution, but there was also confidence that improved air transport and artillery would give the Allies an advantage once they chose the time and place for their own offensive. Inside Japanese command structures, the opening phase of U-Go involved debate as well as obedience. Some staff officers in Burma Area Army argued that marching large formations through mountainous terrain at the end of the dry season, with supply columns stretched for many kilometers, carried risks that could not be offset solely by morale and surprise. Mutaguchi and his supporters accepted those risks, convinced that a concentrated blow at Imphal and Kohima would destroy the main British and Indian field forces in the theater and stimulate political unrest inside India. For Tokyo, a successful move into Assam promised to disrupt Allied air routes to China and improve bargaining positions in any future negotiations. Local civilian communities along the projected routes experienced the opening of the operation in different ways. In the Kabao Valley and along the Burma side of the Chindwin, villagers saw increased Japanese requisitions of rice, livestock, and labor as units assembled. In Manipur and the Naga Hills, administrators and police received instructions for preparing emergency labor drafts, strengthening airfield and depot security, and planning for possible evacuation of non-essential personnel from Imphal and Kohima. At the same time, most local inhabitants had limited information about higher-level plans and could only respond to immediate demands for porters, guides, and supplies from whichever forces controlled their area at a given moment. By early March 1944, the opening movements of U-Go began. Japanese columns started crossing the Chindwin at several points using ferries, rafts, and fords, often at night or under jungle cover. Forward detachments of the 33rd Division moved toward the Tidum Road. Elements of the 15th Division advanced on Tamu, and leading units of the 31st Division turned north and west into the Naga Hills. Contact patrols, scouts, and small covering forces from the 17th and 20th Indian Divisions reported increasing encounters with Japanese reconnaissance parties and signs of major movements in the forests east of the frontier. These reports gradually altered the assumptions in Allied headquarters. What had initially been interpreted as possible spoiling attacks inside Burma now appeared to involve significant forces heading toward the Indian border itself. During the second week of March, commanders at 14th Army and a V Corps began to redirect their attention from the timetable of their planned advance to the immediate problem of securing their forward divisions and protecting the lines of communication to Imphal and Kohima. The opening phase of the campaign thus closed with both sides in motion. Japanese divisions advancing into the hills with the expectation of a decisive encounter in India, and Allied forces shifting from offensive preparation to an unexpectedly urgent defensive posture. Strategic objectives for the coming campaign were defined at several levels, and they did not always align. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters viewed the Burma Front as one segment of a much wider conflict, stretching from the Central Pacific to China. The main requirement there was to hold the natural barrier formed by mountains and jungle between India and Southeast Asia, secure the access routes to resource areas in Malaya, Sumatra, and the Netherlands East Indies, and prevent Allied air power from reaching deeper into the Japanese sphere. Within this framework, a bold move into India appeared as one possible way to unsettle Allied planning, disrupt supply routes to China, and demonstrate to Asian audiences that British power was vulnerable. At Burma Area Army level, staff defined more specific goals for the offensive. 15th Army was to advance across the Chindwin, defeat the principal field formations of 14th Army in the Imphal Basin, sever the road between Imphal and Kohima, and threaten the Dimapur railhead. The destruction of 4th Corps was considered the decisive operational objective. If that could be achieved, further exploitation into the Brahmaputra Valley was envisaged, but not fully planned in detail, because it depended on the results of the initial battles and the availability of supplies. Japanese calculations assumed that once Allied depots at Imphal, Kohima, and possibly Dimapur were captured, the attackers could use those stocks to sustain further movement. Political goals were closely linked to these military plans. Japanese authorities and the leadership of the Indian National Army hoped that an advance onto Indian soil, especially into Assam and Manipur, would encourage anti-colonial feeling and provide an opportunity to proclaim a provisional Indian government on territory no longer under British control. The inclusion of INA detachments in the operational plan was intended to give the offensive an Indian component that could be presented as cooperation rather than occupation. In practice, INA units were allocated to secondary sectors and tasked with propaganda, intelligence gathering, and limited combat support. On the Allied side, strategic planning was shaped by different constraints. For the British government and the authorities in New Delhi, the primary aim in this theater was to prevent any incursion that might threaten the internal security of India or the key communication lines running through Bengal and Assam. At the same time, Allied global planning required reopening land communications with China and eventually recovering Burma. 14th Army and Southeast Asia Command therefore worked on a phased offensive eastward, based on road building, accumulation of supplies at forward bases, and increasing use of air transport. Within that broader concept, the defense of Imphal, Kohima, and Dimapur became essential because these points anchored the road, rail, and air network linking the Indian interior with the Burma front. Planning documents on both sides contained detailed logistics tables, but they were built on different assumptions. Japanese staff limited the scale of motor transport and heavy artillery in order to move divisions along narrow mountain tracks. They accepted that most supplies would have to be carried by porters and pack animals, and that columns would be separated from their main depots by long distances once across the Chindwin. To compensate, they assumed a strict ration scale, the possibility of local requisition of food in Manipur and the Naga Hills, and the early capture of Allied dumps around Imphal and along the main road toward Kohima. These assumptions reduced the weight of supply columns, but left little margin if resistance proved stronger than expected, or movement slower. Allied planners placed more weight on mechanized and air logistics. Engineers worked to improve the Dimapur-Imphal road, to enlarge airfields in the Imphal basin and at other sites in Assam, and to standardize depots for fuel, rations, and ammunition that could be replenished from the ports of Calcutta and Chittagong. They anticipated heavy monsoon rains and therefore accepted that large parts of the theater would depend on air supply for several months each year. Training programs introduced units to the practice of receiving supplies by parachute and landing, and to the medical and organizational measures needed to maintain troops in jungle and hill conditions over long periods. Intelligence and planning interacted unevenly with these logistics concepts. Japanese assessments of Allied capabilities recognized the growth of air power in India, but underestimated the scale on which transport aircraft could be used to resupply encircled units in isolated positions. The expectation that British and Indian troops would retreat once their surface lines of communication were threatened reflected earlier campaigns. Allied assessments, in contrast, often underestimated the readiness of Japanese infantry to move long distances on minimal rations and to accept high levels of sickness and fatigue if commanders considered the objective important. 15th Army divided its front into sectors corresponding to the axes of advance of its three divisions, with coordination to be maintained by liaison officers and pre-arranged timetables rather than by continuous radio communication in order to preserve security. 14th Army defined responsibilities between 4th Corps around Imphal and higher headquarters controlling forces at Kohima, Dimapur, and the Brahmaputra Valley, but some of these arrangements were still evolving as the offensive opened. The result was a situation in which both sides entered the campaign with clearly stated objectives and carefully drawn plans, yet with differing views of the terrain, the likely behavior of their opponents, and the limits of their own supply systems. The first clashes of the campaign developed along three main axes. In the south, 33rd Division moved against the Tiddim Road. In the east, 15th Division advanced toward Tamu and the Shenam Heights. In the north, 31st Division crossed into the Naga Hills on the approaches to Kohima. Japanese columns moved in dispersed groups to ease the strain on narrow tracks, with infantry, pack animals, and porters following guides through jungle-covered ridges. Contact with Allied screening forces became more frequent from mid-March 1944, as patrols reported movement on routes that had previously been quiet. On the Tiddim Road, 17th Indian Division confronted the first major pressure. Its battalions were spread along a long line of communication between Imphal and Tiddim, with road maintenance detachments and small garrisons at bridges and supply points. As 30th Division pushed north, Japanese advance guards began to cut the road at several points. Ambush vehicle convoys and seized dominating heights overlooking bends and defiles. The pattern was similar in many locations. Forward Indian companies or platoons held small posts, came under artillery and mortar fire, and then faced infantry assaults supported by machine guns and grenade dischargers. Where positions became untenable, orders were issued to withdraw in stages toward more defensible terrain nearer Imphal. Along the eastern approach, 15th Division concentrated against positions held by 20th Indian Division in the Kabul Valley and on the Shinam Saddle. The initial Allied line there consisted of company and battalion localities covering tracks across the frontier and the main road from Tamu. Japanese infantry used night movement and knowledge of minor paths to bypass some outposts and appear on flanks and rear slopes, forcing defenders to reorient their fields of fire. Artillery on both sides was limited by the difficulty of moving guns into position. So much of the fighting took the form of infantry attacks with close-range support weapons. In this sector, Allied units began to fall back toward prepared positions on the high ground that guarded the direct route into the Imphal plain. In the north, the opening engagements had a different character. 31st Division's task was to reach and cut the road between Imphal and Kohima and, if possible, seize Kohima itself and then move toward Dimapur. To cover the main approaches through the Naga Hills, Allied command deployed the 50th Indian Parachute Brigade to the area around Sangshak, a village located on a ridge astride tracks leading west. The brigade, with roughly 3,500 men, began to consolidate defensive positions on a series of knolls and shallow trenches. Japanese advance elements, numbering several times that strength once the main bodies of 31st Division arrived, converged on this locality in the third week of March. The Battle of Sangshak became the first major set-piece engagement of the northern sector. Brigade headquarters and battalions organized all-round defenses, prepared ammunition and ration dumps, and tried to improve water supply under frequent shelling. Japanese units attempted to reduce these positions by repeated assaults from different directions, supported by mortars and infantry guns. For several days, both sides fought at short range over a limited area. Casualties mounted, and both Japanese and Indian medical personnel struggled to treat wounded men in crowded aid posts with restricted evacuation possibilities. When the brigade eventually received orders to withdraw westward, it did so with reduced numbers, but the time gain delayed the advance of 31st Division toward Kohima. These early engagements produced immediate territorial changes. Japanese forces secured control of long stretches of the Tidum Road south of Imphal and gained footholds on ridges east of the plain. Allied units yielded ground in the Kabul Valley and some forward positions on the frontier, trading space for time and attempting to avoid encirclement in locations where supply by road or air would be impossible. In the north, although Sangshak fell, the delay imposed by the defense affected the schedule for the move on Kohima and the cutting of the Dimapur-Imphal road. Both sides monitored these shifts carefully, comparing actual progress with pre-campaign timetables. Civilian populations in the affected areas experienced the first phase of the fighting through movement, requisition, and occasional bombardment. Villagers along the Tidum and Tamu roads saw columns of troops, pack animals, and vehicles passing in both directions, with demands for food, labor, and information. In some localities in Manipur, families left homes near main roads to take temporary shelter in more remote hamlets or in the surrounding hills. In the Naga Hills, village councils faced the problem of dealing with patrols from both armies, each seeking guides and carriers. The presence of artillery and mortars on the ridges also exposed some settlements to stray shells and small arms fire. Morale on both sides reflected the mixed results of these first encounters. Japanese reports recorded satisfaction at having crossed the frontier and established contact with Allied forces on Indian soil, but also noted the strain on porters and animals moving ammunition and rations forward over long distances. Allied headquarters, receiving accounts of withdrawals and lost positions, identified the risk that 4th Corps could find its divisions separated and its supply lines cut. At the same time, field reports from Sangshak and other localities showed that well-prepared defensive positions, supported by air supply when possible, could impose significant delays on attacking units. An unexpected element in this phase was the growing role of air power in small-scale engagements. Allied aircraft conducted reconnaissance over the roads and tracks leading from the Chindwin, attacked identified columns where terrain allowed, and began to drop supplies to units that were already partly isolated. Japanese anti-aircraft resources in the area were limited, consisting mainly of light guns and machine guns, which could protect specific points but not the entire length of advancing columns. As the opening battles concluded, both commands adjusted their expectations. The Japanese recognized that opposition would be more determined and protracted than in earlier Burma campaigns, while Allied leaders saw that the thrust toward Imphal and Kohima was larger and more coordinated than the spoiling attacks they had initially anticipated. By late March 1944, the campaign shifted from probing clashes to a crisis of positions and supply lines. Japanese columns on all three axes pushed beyond initial contacts and aimed at isolating major Allied formations. On the Tidum Road, 33rd Division continued cutting the route at multiple points, forcing 17th Indian Division to conduct a fighting withdrawal over successive ridgelines toward the Imphal plain. Vehicle movement became increasingly hazardous. Some convoys were destroyed in ambushes, others abandoned and their loads transferred to porters or destroyed to prevent capture. Rear parties prepared demolition charges at bridges and culverts to slow pursuit. On the Eastern Front, 15th Division's pressure against 20th Indian Division intensified around the Shinam Saddle and adjacent heights. Here, the terrain narrowed into a series of knife-edge ridges and steep slopes that controlled the road into Imphal. Japanese battalions attempted repeated assaults to capture key features, while Allied troops organized interlocking fields of fire from bunkers and trenches dug into the hard ground. Casualties rose as attacks and counterattacks took place at short range. Artillery fire, though limited by supply constraints, was concentrated onto small areas, and both sides expended significant stocks of mortar and small arms ammunition to hold or take individual hilltops. In the northern sector, 31st Division extended its presence along the approaches to Kohima. After Sangshak, Japanese units moved toward the Imphal-Kohima road, with the intention of severing it at several points. By early April, advanced elements had reached positions close to Kohima Ridge and the nearby village of Jotsoma, while other detachments crossed the road further south to cut communications with Imphal. This threatened to isolate Kohima garrison and, if reinforced, could open the way to Dimapur. Allied command responded by deploying additional battalions and directing Ixvistahi III Corps to take direct control of operations in the area. But movement of reinforcements along the congested road was slowed by traffic, narrow curves, and the risk of sudden encounters with Japanese blocking forces. For 4th Corps and 14th Army headquarters, the situation now amounted to a developing encirclement. 17th Indian Division in the south and 20th Indian Division in the east were both engaged in heavy fighting while withdrawing toward the Imphal plain. At the same time, reports indicated that Japanese units were appearing on tracks west and northwest of Imphal, threatening to complete a ring around the basin. Commanders faced the choice between holding forward positions that still covered parts of the Tidum and Tamu roads, or concentrating forces closer to Imphal to avoid piecemeal isolation. The decision gradually shifted toward concentration. Orders were issued to shorten lines, destroy surplus stores that could not be evacuated, and prepare the plain for a potential siege supplied primarily by air. The logistical burden increased sharply for both sides. Japanese supply columns had now been on the move for weeks, carrying rations and ammunition from depots east of the Chindwin. Losses of animals through exhaustion and disease, combined with the need to station troops on bypassed heights and roadblocks, reduced the proportion of manpower available at the spearheads. Some units began to report reduced ration scales and shortages of medical supplies. Allied depots in Imphal and along the road to Kohima, though better stocked, also felt strain as vehicle losses and road cuts complicated service transport. Air Force planners had to calculate how many sorties and aircraft could be devoted to resupplying 4th Corps and garrisons along the road, while still supporting other operations in the theater. Civilian conditions deteriorated in parallel with military escalation. Villagers around Imphal found fields and tracks crowded with troop movements, artillery positions, and temporary dumps. Requisitions of food and labor increased, sometimes compensated, sometimes not, depending on local arrangements and the urgency of military needs. In the Naga Hills, some communities moved from villages near strategic ridges to more remote locations, while still being drawn into porterage and intelligence networks. Administrative authorities in Imphal and Kohima worked on evacuation plans for non-essential personnel, yet many local inhabitants chose or were obliged to remain in place, balancing the risk of bombardment against the difficulty of moving elderly relatives and household goods over mountain roads. Within Japanese command, the escalation produced tensions over tempo and objectives. The original plan envisaged rapid capture of Imphal and Kohima before Allied air and ground reinforcements could build up. As the calendar advanced into April and key features remained contested, staff officers had to reconcile reports of progress on some fronts with evidence of delay on others. Requests for additional supplies and reinforcements competed with the limited capacity of routes back across the Chindwin. Nevertheless, Mutaguchi continued to demand offensive action, arguing that persistent pressure was essential to break Allied resistance before the onset of the full monsoon. Allied leaders faced their own set of pressures. 14th Army Headquarters, receiving messages from 4th Corps, Kohima, and Dimapur, identified the risk that Japanese forces might simultaneously isolate Imphal, overrun Kohima, and reach Dimapur. To address this, they accelerated the movement of additional divisions toward the Brahmaputra Valley, reorganized command boundaries, and requested increased allocations of transport aircraft and combat squadrons from higher Allied commands. At the same time, public information within India was managed carefully, with communiques acknowledging heavy fighting in the northeast, but emphasizing measures taken to reinforce the area and maintain control of the main communication lines. By early April 1944, the battle had thus escalated from dispersed encounters into a theater-wide crisis centered on two nodes, the Imphal Basin and the Kohima Ridge. Japanese forces held large stretches of the approaches and had cut or threatened key roads. Allied formations were consolidating for defense under conditions that increasingly relied on air supply. Both sides recognized that the coming weeks, coinciding with the transition toward the monsoon season, would test not only their tactical skill, but the endurance of their logistics systems and the resilience of soldiers and civilians in an extended campaign in the hills. The campaign reached its peak in April and early May 1944, when fighting around Imphal and Kohima became continuous, and the outcome remained uncertain. At Imphal, 4th Corps found itself effectively cut off by land as Japanese detachments blocked the main roads and occupied many of the surrounding ridges. Within the basin, 4 Indian divisions and supporting arms were deployed in a ring of positions covering airfields, supply dumps, and headquarters sites. Outside that perimeter, 15th and 30th 3rd Divisions, with attached units and elements of the Indian National Army, manned their own lines on high ground, overlooking the routes into the plain, and prepared repeated assaults on selected strongpoints. On the south and east of Imphal, the struggle centered on individual hill features that dominated road junctions and airstrips. Japanese infantry organized night attacks and infiltration against bunkers and trenches held by companies from 17th, 20th, and later 5th Indian Divisions. Some assaults brought attackers to within a few meters of Allied wire and weapon pits before being driven back by small arms fire, grenades, and occasional tank support. Local counterattacks by infantry and armor attempted to retake lost crests or to push attackers off nearby spurs that threatened artillery observation. In several actions, the numbers engaged on each side were in the hundreds rather than the thousands, but the cumulative effect of these engagements was to inflict steady casualties and test the endurance of frontline units. Air supply now became central to IV Corps' survival. With the Tidum and Tamu roads largely unusable, Royal Air Force and United States Army Air Force's transport squadrons maintained a shuttle of Dakota and other aircraft into Imphal's airstrips. Every day, tons of rations, ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies were flown in, and wounded personnel were flown out. The airfields themselves were within range of Japanese artillery and subject to occasional air attack. So, Flying operations required careful coordination with ground defense. Stocks in the depots fluctuated according to weather and aircraft availability. But the continued operation of this air bridge allowed units on the perimeter to hold positions that would otherwise have been untenable. At Kohima, the peak of the campaign took a different but equally intense form. After reaching the area in early April, 31st Division surrounded the small garrison on the Kohima Ridge, which consisted of a composite force of British, Indian, and Assam regiment troops, administrative personnel, and local levies numbering a few thousand. Within a compact perimeter around the deputy commissioner's bungalow, the tennis court, and nearby knolls, defenders dug slit trenches and weapon pits only a short distance from Japanese positions. In some sectors, opposing trenches lay so close that grenades could be thrown directly from one system into the other. Over several days, Japanese units attempted to capture individual sections of the ridge by frontal assaults, while defenders relied on small arms, a limited number of mortars, and, when available, artillery fire directed from supporting positions near Jotsoma. Relief operations along the Dimapur-Kohima-Imphal road added another layer to the peak phase. From the north, fresh formations including British 2nd Division and additional Indian brigades moved south from Dimapur, fighting through a series of roadblocks and strongpoints established by elements of 31st Division. Each ridge crossing the road became the scene of attacks and counterattacks. Engineers worked to repair culverts and clear fallen trees while under fire. The progress of these relief columns was measured in kilometers gained over days, with casualty returns reflecting the difficulty of forcing a passage through terrain where each bend could be covered from several angles. Civilian experience in this period reflected the concentration of firepower on limited spaces. In Imphal, many inhabitants moved into improvised shelters or left the town for nearby villages when shelling and air raids increased. Markets functioned intermittently, with prices for basic goods rising as supplies became restricted to what could be flown in or produced locally. At Kohima, the small town's civil structures were progressively damaged by artillery and small arms fire. Some administrative and commercial buildings became strong points, others collapsed or burned. In the Naga Hills more broadly, villages close to the main road saw heavy traffic by both armies and suffered from requisitions of food, livestock, and labor, while more remote settlements were drawn into porterage and intelligence work for one or other side. For Japanese troops around Imphal and Kohima, the peak of the campaign coincided with growing logistical strain. Rations often fell below planned scales. Some units reported living for days on reduced rice issues and locally collected food. Medical services struggled to cope with battle casualties and with diseases such as malaria and dysentery, which increased as the pre-monsoon rains began. Ammunition expenditure and repeated assaults on hill positions exceeded initial calculations, requiring difficult decisions on which sectors to prioritize. Reports from frontline commanders indicated both determination to continue the offensive and concern over the sustainability of operations at the existing tempo. Allied forces also faced limits. Infantry battalions on the Imphal perimeter and at Kohima suffered steady attrition in platoon and company strength, with experienced junior leaders among the losses. Medical units had to manage high numbers of wounded and sick while maintaining evacuation chains to the airstrips. Air crews flew frequent sorties in variable weather, navigating through hills and cloud to reach short airfields under the threat of ground fire. Nevertheless, by early May, the continued functioning of the air supply system, the arrival of reinforcements along the Dimapur road, and the maintenance of defensive perimeters at Imphal and on the Kohima Ridge indicated that the peak of Japanese offensive capacity was approaching, even if this was not yet fully visible to all participants on the ground. As the offensive reached its limit in May 1944, both commands shifted from the hope of rapid decision to methods aimed at sustaining or breaking a protracted fight. Around Imphal, 4th Corps reorganized its perimeter into a series of mutually supporting boxes, each held by a brigade or battalion group with its own all-round defenses, internal reserves, and pre-arranged artillery fire plans. Infantry platoons improved trenches, overhead cover, and communication trenches between weapon pits, while engineers constructed new tracks within the basin to ease the movement of tanks and supply vehicles between sectors. Where terrain allowed, Sherman and Lee tanks were positioned on reverse slopes and road cuttings, providing direct fire against Japanese positions that had been difficult to reach with small arms alone. Air Force and Army staffs refined procedures for air supply and close support. Transport aircraft now flew along defined approach routes, timed to minimize interference with fighter and bomber operations. Loads were broken down into standardized containers that could be distributed rapidly on landing or dropped by parachute to units holding more exposed features. Ground controllers with radio sets were placed in forward localities to call in artillery, or, when weather permitted, fighter bombers against identified concentrations or supply columns. These adaptations did not eliminate shortages, but they reduced the risk that any one sector would be cut off from ammunition or medical supplies during a critical period. Japanese units around Imphal responded with their own adjustments, recognizing that repeated frontal assaults on prepared positions produced high casualties. Some regimental commanders shifted emphasis toward infiltration, digging new approach trenches and saps to bring assault groups closer under cover of darkness. Others strengthened their own defensive localities in expectation of Allied counterattacks, building log and earth bunkers on ridge crests, and preparing concealed positions for machine guns and grenade dischargers. Efforts were made to concentrate fire on airstrips at times of peak activity, using limited artillery and heavy weapons to damage runways or aircraft on the ground, although shortages of shells restricted the duration of such bombardments. At Kohima and along the Dimapur-Imphal road, adaptation took the form of increasingly systematic ridge-by-ridge operations. British and Indian battalions advancing south from Dimapur moved in closely coordinated groups with attached artillery, engineers, and medical sections. Before each assault, artillery observers mapped Japanese bunkers and trenches on the next ridge, using air photographs, patrol reports, and direct observation. Fire plans then allocated field and medium artillery to neutralize these targets, sometimes firing thousands of rounds over a few hours onto a limited area. Infantry companies advanced behind this fire, using section-level tactics to outflank surviving positions, while engineers followed to clear mines and repair the road surface. Defenders of the Kohima Ridge itself adapted their dispositions as reinforcement arrived. Initial compact perimeters around administrative buildings were widened into a deeper defensive zone, incorporating new weapon pits and communication trenches. Relief of front-line companies, where possible, reduced the time individuals spent under constant close-range fire. Medical arrangements became more systematic, with aid posts positioned just behind the forward trenches and evacuation routes planned to the rear under cover of darkness. Despite high casualties, this organization allowed the garrison to maintain effective manning of key sectors until the northern relief columns linked up. Local civilian populations also adjusted to the prolonged presence of large forces. In Imphal, municipal and military authorities organized rationing schemes and price controls for certain staples to prevent speculative rises in markets supplied from air-delivered stocks. Some families sent women and children to relatives in villages outside the basin when opportunities arose, while able-bodied men were employed as laborers on airfields, depots, and roadworks. In the Naga Hills, village councils refined systems of liaison with Allied patrols, providing guides and porters in exchange for assurances regarding the protection of their settlements. At the same time, Japanese detachments continued to requisition the food and labor in areas they controlled, forcing local leaders to balance competing demands. Within the Indian National Army contingents attached to Japanese formations, adaptation took on a political and personal dimension. Some INA units were employed mainly in propaganda and intelligence roles, distributing leaflets and making loudspeaker appeals to Indian troops in Allied lines, emphasizing themes of national liberation and shared language or region. Others took part in patrols and local attacks on outposts or roadblocks. Their presence required additional security measures from Allied commanders, including screening procedures for prisoners and attention to rumors within Indian units, but also revealed limits to the expectation that large numbers of soldiers would change sides in the middle of an active campaign. Psychological responses among frontline troops evolved as the weeks passed. Japanese soldiers, operating far from their main bases and often on reduced rations, relied heavily on unit cohesion and a sense of obligation to hold positions already taken. Reports noted instances of extreme fatigue, yet also continued willingness to conduct night movements and carry loads when ordered. On the Allied side, many British and Indian soldiers who had previously experienced retreat in Burma drew contrasting conclusions from the continued defense of Imphal and Kohima. The knowledge that wounded comrades could be evacuated by air and that ammunition stocks were being replenished despite encirclement gradually reinforced confidence that the positions could be held until larger operational changes took effect. Higher command structures similarly adjusted. 14th Army redistributed artillery, armor, and transport assets between corps to match the evolving situation, while Southeast Asia Command coordinated additional air resources from other theaters as far as global priorities allowed. Japanese Burma Area Army, receiving increasingly detailed reports on casualties and supply shortages, issued instructions intended to rationalize logistics, including reductions in ration scales and attempts to use local crops more systematically. In practice, the effectiveness of such measures varied by sector, depending on terrain, local harvests, and the degree of control each side could exercise over movement on minor tracks and paths. By late May, these patterns of resistance and adaptation had created a new balance along the front. Japanese forces still occupied extensive areas of high ground and retained the ability to launch local attacks, but their capacity to mount large coordinated assaults had diminished. Allied formations, though worn by months of fighting, now possessed more experience in hill and jungle operations, better integrated artillery and air support, and a clearer understanding of the routes by which they might transition from defense to offensive action once conditions permitted. The turning point of the campaign emerged gradually between late April and June 1944, as conditions on the ground diverged from the assumptions behind Operation U-Go. At Kohima, the first visible change came when relief columns advancing from Dimapur linked up with the Ridge garrison in mid-April. The encirclement was broken, and fresh troops of British 2nd Division and Indian brigades began to rotate into front-line positions. Artillery was brought forward in greater numbers, including medium batteries capable of sustained fire on Japanese strongpoints. This altered the local balance. Japanese units that had previously contested each knoll at close quarters now faced concentrated bombardments before each Allied advance along the ridge. As the road north of Kohima was gradually cleared, Allied convoys began to move more regularly between Dimapur and the hill positions, carrying ammunition, rations, and engineering materials. Each reopened section of road shortened the supply line to the front and allowed the systematic buildup of resources for further operations southward. For Japanese troops of the 31st Division around Kohima, the same road became more exposed to observation and artillery fire, complicating their own attempts to move food and ammunition forward from depots east of the Chindwin. Patrol reports recorded increasing difficulty in maintaining continuous lines between battalions, and some positions had to be thinned out or abandoned to preserve strength on key features. Around Imphal, the shift was initially less visible, but equally significant. Air supply continued at high intensity, and forward units reported that ammunition and basic rations, though sometimes tight, remained available. Tanks and artillery were positioned for counterattacks on selected slopes, where Japanese units had dug in after earlier assaults. In a series of local operations, companies and battalions from 5th, 17th, and 20th Indian Divisions attacked nearby ridge systems with close air support and coordinated artillery. Success in these engagements gained ground beyond the original perimeter, improved observation over Japanese lines, and brought some Allied positions closer to the tracks along which Japanese supply parties moved. Meanwhile, Japanese logistics reached a critical point. Supply columns crossing the Chindwin had already been operating at the limit of their capacity for weeks. Losses of animals, the onset of heavier rains, and the need to feed both combat and rear echelon personnel reduced the amount of grain reaching forward units. Some battalions reported receiving only part of their planned rice ration, supplemented by locally collected roots and vegetables. cases of disease increased, and medical units, themselves short of supplies, struggled to treat both battle casualties and sick personnel. Reports to Burma Area Army indicated that some frontline companies were operating at well below establishment strength. The contrast between the two supply systems became more pronounced once the Dimapur-Kohima road reopened for continuous traffic. Allied formations could now bring forward heavier artillery, more vehicles, and additional infantry from depots in the Assam plains. Repair units worked behind the advancing front to stabilize the road surface against rain damage, ensuring that the flow of convoys could be maintained. Air transport, no longer the only lifeline for Imphal, could be concentrated on specific tasks such as lifting reinforcements, evacuating casualties, and delivering supplies to localities still inaccessible by road. This integration of road and air logistics allowed planning for larger-scale counteroffensives. For Japanese command, the changing situation posed a dilemma. The original concept of U-Go had anticipated a short campaign resulting in the capture of Imphal and Kohima before serious supply shortages developed. By late May, those objectives had not been attained, while losses in men and material were substantial. Yet withdrawing in the face of intact Allied forces risked exposing central Burma to a counter-offensive. Discussions between 15th Army and Burma Area Army weighed the possibility of continuing the siege of Imphal against the growing evidence that formations in the field could no longer be kept at effective fighting strength without major changes in the supply situation. On the ground, these developments translated into a gradual shift in initiative. At Kohima, Allied troops moved from defending a confined perimeter to attacking Japanese positions along successive ridges southwards, while at Imphal, the perimeter was pushed outward in several sectors. Japanese units increasingly found themselves reacting to these moves rather than choosing the time and place of engagements. Attempts to organize new assaults on well-supplied and reinforced positions met with limited success, in part because depleted battalions could not assemble the numbers required for sustained attacks, and in part because artillery and air responses were now rapid and concentrated. Civilian perceptions also registered the turning point. In Imphal, the visible presence of incoming convoys once the land routes began to reopen, and the continued operation of airfields despite shelling, signaled to local inhabitants that the town was less likely to be overrun than many had feared in March and early April. In the Naga Hills, information passed between villages and military liaison officers indicated that Japanese parties were moving with greater difficulty and that some outlying positions had been vacated. At the same time, requisitions and labor demands from both sides did not cease, and the risk of bombardment remained, so the improvement in the military situation did not immediately translate into normal civilian life. Within the Indian National Army detachments, the turning point sharpened questions about future prospects. Some INA personnel, observing the shift in momentum and the material advantages of the Allied side, reconsidered the likelihood that the campaign would create a lasting base for a provisional Indian authority on liberated territory. Allied interrogations of captured INA soldiers later recorded a spectrum of motives: continued commitment to political objectives, concern for personal survival, and calculations about how best to navigate the changing balance of power. By June 1944, the combined effect of these factors had produced a clear, though not yet publicly declared transition. Japanese divisions around Imphal and Kohima remained in contact and held substantial stretches of high ground, but their offensive capacity had peaked. Allied forces, benefiting from restored surface communications, integrated air and artillery support, and cumulative experience in hill fighting, were preparing to move from containment to a general offensive aimed at lifting the sieges and driving 15th Army back toward the Chindwan. By July 1944, the fighting around Imphal and Kohima had shifted decisively from siege to withdrawal. Along the Dimapur-Kohima-Imphal road, Allied formations advanced south and east, clearing successive Japanese positions from the ridges that had earlier blocked movement. Each feature was attacked with artillery preparation, infantry assault, and engineer follow-up, gradually reopening the entire length of the route. Convoys began to move more freely between Assam and the Imphal basin, bringing in additional supplies and evacuating wounded and sick personnel. For 4th Corps, this meant that air supply, though still important, no longer formed the sole lifeline. On the Japanese side, 15th Army faced the cumulative impact of casualties, disease, and supply exhaustion. Battalion and regimental returns showed companies reduced far below their authorized strengths. Units that had advanced into the hills in March with full loads of ammunition and rations now reported shortages of both, despite attempts to supplement rice issues through local collection. As monsoon rains intensified, tracks became mud, rivers rose, and movement slowed further. The same terrain that had earlier offered concealment for the advance now complicated any organized retreat. Commanders had to decide whether to hold remaining positions near Imphal and Kohima, or to pull back while they still retained enough strength to avoid collapse during withdrawal. Orders for a general withdrawal were eventually issued, directing the 15th and 30th 3rd Divisions to break contact around Imphal and fall back toward the Chindwin, while the 30th 1st Division was to disengage from the Kohima sector and retreat eastward through the Naga Hills. These movements were carried out under pressure. Allied units, aware that opponents were attempting to withdraw, increased patrol activity and mounted attacks on rear guards and roadblocks. Artillery and, where weather allowed, airstrikes targeted river crossings, bridges, and known track junctions. Japanese rear parties fought delaying actions at selected points, but the combination of rain, difficult terrain, and limited supplies made sustained resistance hard to maintain. Casualty figures for the campaign reflected these conditions. Allied forces in the Imphal-Kohima theater suffered tens of thousands of killed, wounded, and sick, with a significant share of non-battle casualties due to disease and the stresses of prolonged operations in the hills. Japanese losses were higher in absolute and relative terms, with large numbers of soldiers dying not only in combat, but also from malnutrition, exhaustion, and illness during the retreat. Many wounded could not be evacuated from forward localities and were left in improvised shelters or village buildings, where survival depended on the availability of local assistance and the chance arrival of medical parties. The civilian consequences of the withdrawal phase were uneven. In areas where Japanese units had remained for months, the sudden departure of troops reduced requisition demands, but left communities with depleted food stocks and damaged infrastructure. In some villages, abandoned positions contained unexploded ordnance and damaged buildings, posing hazards long after the main forces had passed. Along the reopened roads, local traders began to reappear, supplying markets in Imphal and Kohima with goods from surrounding districts, yet transport remained limited and prices for many items stayed high. Administrative authorities faced the task of repairing roads, bridges, and public buildings, while at the same time dealing with displaced persons and families, seeking news of relatives who had served as porters or had been caught in the fighting. Within the Indian National Army, the retreat raised practical and political questions. Units that had advanced into the Imphal sector alongside Japanese formations now had to withdraw across the same difficult terrain, sharing shortages and exposure. For some personnel, the experience reinforced commitment to their cause. For others, it highlighted the risks of dependence on external support. Allied interrogations of captured INA members after the campaign indicated varied responses. Some remained convinced that the offensive had been a necessary step toward independence, while others expressed disillusionment with the outcome and concern about their status if captured by British or Indian authorities. For the armies involved, the end of major combat around Imphal and Kohima did not mean an immediate cessation of operations in the wider Burma theater. 14th Army began to plan further offensives aimed at crossing the Chindwin and advancing toward central Burma once conditions allowed. Lessons from the campaign were incorporated into training and doctrine, emphasis on integrated air supply and road maintenance, refined procedures for jungle and hill fighting, and reinforced medical and malaria control measures. Japanese Burma Area Army, confronted with depleted divisions and a shortened front, had to reconsider how to defend the approaches to Mandalay and the Irrawaddy against future Allied advances. Psychologically, the withdrawal had lasting effects on participants. For many Japanese soldiers, the march back from Imphal and Kohima through rain-soaked hills on reduced rations left a strong impression of physical and moral strain. even among units that maintained discipline and cohesion. For British and Indian troops, the lifting of the siege and the reopening of land communications contrasted sharply with memories of the 1942 retreat from Burma, influencing perceptions of what could be achieved in subsequent campaigns. Among local civilians in Manipur and the Naga Hills, the passing of the main forces left a complex legacy of loss, adaptation, and new connections formed with military authorities during the months of shared hardship. By the late months of 1944, the immediate aftermath of the battle was visible in the changed map of the front. The Japanese attempt to carry the war into India had been reversed, and Allied formations now stood once again along the Burmese frontier with greater experience and improved infrastructure. At the same time, many of the human and material costs of the campaign, in damaged villages, altered livelihoods, and long-term health effects, remained embedded in the lives of those who had lived and fought in the hills around Imphal and Kohima. In the longer term, the battles of Imphal and Kohima altered both the military balance in Burma and wider perceptions of the war in South and Southeast Asia. Operationally, the failure of Operation U-Go meant that the front stabilized east of the Indian frontier. Japanese forces had committed roughly 3 divisions and supporting troops, totaling more than 80,000 men at the outset, and lost a high proportion of them through combat, disease, and exhaustion. Allied casualties in the theater ran into tens of thousands killed, wounded, and sick, but their formations remained coherent and capable of further offensive action. The attempt to carry the conflict onto Indian soil had not achieved its objectives and had weakened 15th Army's ability to hold central Burma in the following year. From late 1944 into 1945, 14th Army used the bases, supply routes, and experience gained in the Imphal-Kohima campaign to mount a new series of operations. Reinforced British, Indian, and African divisions crossed the Chindwin, fought their way through the Shwebo Plain and across the Irrawaddy, and eventually reached Meiktila, Mandalay, and Rangoon. The logistical methods tested at Imphal, large-scale air supply, integrated road maintenance, and close cooperation between ground and air commands, underpinned these later advances. For Japanese Burma Area Army, the manpower and material expended in India could not be replaced at the same scale, contributing to the gradual contraction of their defensive perimeter in Burma and limiting their ability to respond to further Allied offensives. The implications for the British Indian Army were substantial. At Imphal and Kohima, Indian units had fought alongside British, Gurkha, and African battalions in complex hill and jungle operations, often under siege conditions and on air-supplied rations. After the war, official histories and internal reports used these campaigns as evidence that the Army had become a large, technically capable force rather than a narrowly colonial garrison. Many of the officers and NCOs who had served in the battles later occupied senior positions in the armies of independent India and Pakistan, bringing with them tactical and organizational lessons learned in 1944. For Indian politics, the results were more ambivalent. The Indian National Army's participation on the Japanese side, though militarily limited compared to the British Indian formations, acquired symbolic importance after 1945. INA officers and men who had been captured in the Imphal sector and elsewhere later appeared in high-profile trials in Delhi, where their actions were debated in terms of loyalty, nationalism, and the legitimacy of armed struggle against colonial rule. Public sympathy for some of the defendants, even among those who had supported the Allied war effort, contributed to changes in opinion about the future of British authority in the subcontinent. At the same time, families of soldiers who had fought in the British Indian Army at Imphal and Kohima regarded those battles as major contributions to the defeat of Japan, adding another layer to the post-war narrative. In Burma, the campaign's legacy was tied to the broader experience of occupation and reoccupation. Many of the areas through which Japanese and Allied columns had moved during the Imphal-Kohima operations later became routes for the 1945 advance toward Rangoon. Villages in the Chin Hills, the Kabah Valley, and Upper Burma had already undergone repeated cycles of requisition and combat. The memory of the 1944 fighting merged with subsequent operations and local accounts. For Burmese political movements, the failure of the Japanese invasion of India and the eventual Allied return weakened earlier expectations that Japanese support would provide a path to lasting independence, and contributed to the complex transition that followed the end of the war. In Japan, the battles entered post-war discussion as examples of the limits of offensive warfare conducted without sufficient logistics. Veterans' testimonies and military analyses highlighted the long marches, reduced rations and disease losses as much as the close-quarter fighting on the ridges. Within debates on war responsibility and strategy, Operation U-Go was sometimes cited as an illustration of the gap between ambitious operational planning and the economic resources available to sustain it. For families of soldiers who did not return from the hills of Manipur and the Naga country, the campaign remained a personal and localized memory linked to specific regiments and prefectures. Commemoration practices reflected these different perspectives. War cemeteries at Imphal and Kohima contain graves of British and Indian soldiers and memorials bearing the names of those with no known burial place. In later decades, Japanese veterans groups and families visited these sites and erected markers of their own, while in nearby towns and villages, local communities established smaller memorials or annual observances for civilians and porters who had died during the fighting. Official ceremonies tended to emphasize sacrifice and endurance rather than victory or defeat. At the same time, school curricula, documentaries, and public discussions in different countries placed the emphasis on different aspects of the campaign. Historians have continued to debate the wider significance of Imphal and Kohima. Some analyses focus on the battles as the point at which Japanese ground forces in the region lost the initiative and could no longer contemplate major offensives beyond their existing fronts. Others place greater weight on the demonstration of Allied capacity to integrate air supply, artillery, and multinational ground forces in difficult terrain, seeing the campaign as a precursor to later operations in Burma and elsewhere. Still others highlight the political consequences, the impact on Indian opinion, the experience of hill communities in Manipur and Nagaland, and the post-war roles of veterans on all sides. Taken together, the battles formed a junction of military, political, and social processes. They marked the high water line of Japan's attempt to extend its land war into India, contributed directly to the later reconquest of Burma, and influenced debates on empire, independence, and military doctrine in the decades that followed. For those who lived through them, soldiers, porters, and civilians in the affected regions, the legacy was carried less in strategic assessments than in memories of prolonged strain on the ridges and in the valleys between Imphal and Kohima.